200 people laughed when my father called my career as a social worker wasting my education playing therapist to people who won't help themselves. He said it during his retirement party speech, in front of colleagues and family and my own coworkers. I was supposed to give a heartfelt speech about what an amazing father he'd been. Instead, I gave him a gift, a portfolio containing 47 letters from homeless teenagers whose lives I'd changed. Letters he'd never bothered to ask about in 10 years of dismissing my work. Welcome back to Calm Drama Story. This one's about the moment I made a room full of lawyers go from laughter to silence by reading aloud what my wasted career had actually accomplished. Hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me what you would have done, and get ready, because this story is about evidence that speaks louder than mockery. Now let me tell you about the retirement party, where I destroyed my father's joke with documentation he couldn't argue with. My name is Lauren Mitchell, and I'm 33 years old. 6 months ago, I stood in front of 200 people at my father's retirement party and watched them laugh when he described my career as a social worker as wasting my education playing therapist to people who won't help themselves. I'd spent weeks preparing a heartfelt speech about what an amazing father he'd been, how much I'd learned from him, how proud I was of his accomplishments. In that moment, standing there with my prepared remarks in my hand while 200 people, including my own colleagues, found it hilarious that my father thought my life's work was a joke, I made a different choice. I gave him a gift instead. A leather-bound portfolio containing 47 letters from young people whose lives I'd changed over 8 years of doing the work he'd just mocked. I read excerpts from those letters aloud in front of everyone, and I watched the room go from laughter to silence to tears in about 90 seconds. This is the story of what happened when I finally showed my father what his daughter's wasted career had actually accomplished. Let me tell you what it's like to grow up as the child of someone who measures worth by prestige and income and status, who sees careers as rankings on a ladder, where some work matters more than other work because it pays better, or sounds more impressive at dinner parties. I'm the daughter of Richard Mitchell, a man who spent 35 years building a reputation as one of the top corporate attorneys in our city, a senior partner at a firm that represented major corporations in complex litigation, someone who billed $800 an hour and won cases that made the news, and built a career that everyone respected and no one questioned. My father is brilliant, there's no denying that. He's strategic and relentless, and capable of seeing angles in legal arguments that other lawyers miss. He built something impressive through decades of 18-hour days and weekends at the office, and dedication that came at the cost of family dinners and school plays, and pretty much every childhood event that happened on a weekday. But he built something nonetheless, and I grew up understanding that his work mattered in ways that were measurable and important and worthy of respect. I have an older brother, Daniel, who's 2 years older than me, born in 1989, when I came along in 1991, and from the time we were old enough to understand what our father did for a living, the expectations were clear about what kinds of careers would make him proud. Daniel would be a lawyer like Dad, carrying on the family tradition, joining the same firm eventually, building the same kind of career. I would also do something prestigious, maybe medicine since I was good at science, maybe business since I was good with people, maybe even law if I wanted to follow Daniel's path, but definitely something that required an advanced degree and came with a title that sounded impressive and generated income that would allow me to live comfortably and retire with the kind of security our father had built for himself. Those were the options that existed in our house. Prestigious career paths that led to money and respect, and the kind of life where you could throw yourself a retirement party at an expensive venue and invite 200 people who'd all show up because your career had mattered enough to build that kind of network. Daniel followed the script perfectly. He went to a good undergraduate school, got a degree in political science, scored well on the LSAT, got into a top 20 law school, graduated in the top quarter of his class, and joined a mid-sized firm where he's been working his way up through the ranks for the past 6 years, doing corporate transactional work that he seems to find adequately interesting, and that pays him enough to afford a nice condo, and a car our father approves of, and a life that looks from the outside like success, measured by all the metrics our father taught us to value. I'm genuinely happy for Daniel. He found a career that suits him, that he's good at, that provides the life he wants. The problem was never Daniel's choices. The problem was that my choices were measured against his, and by our father's standards, my choices looked like failure. I went to the same good undergraduate school Daniel attended, but I majored in social work instead of political science or economics, or any of the pre-professional tracks that would have led to law school or business school or medical school. I chose social work because I'd volunteered at a homeless shelter during high school, and I'd met kids my own age who were living on the streets, who'd aged out of foster care with nowhere to go, who'd been kicked out by families who didn't want them, and I'd realized that someone needed to help them navigate systems that were designed to process people rather than care for them, and I wanted to be that someone. My father thought it was a phase. He thought I'd get to college and realize I could do more with my life, that I'd switch majors to something with better career prospects, that I'd see sense eventually. When I graduated with my BSW and got accepted to a master's program in social work, he sat me down for a conversation I still remember with painful clarity. "You're making a mistake," he said, sitting across from me in his home office, surrounded by law books and framed certificates, and photos of him with judges and prominent clients, all the visible evidence of a career that mattered. "You're a smart girl, Lauren. You could go to law school. You could get an MBA. You could do something that actually pays enough to build a real career. Social workers make what, $40,000 a year? 50 if they're lucky? You're going to waste 6 years of education to make less than my paralegal makes. That's not a career. That's a hobby that happens to pay barely enough to survive." I tried to explain that it wasn't about the money, that it was about making a difference in people's lives, about helping kids who had no one else helping them. He shook his head like I was a child who didn't understand how the world worked. "If you want to help people, get a law degree and do pro bono work. At least then you'll have the financial security to help people without destroying your own future. Social work is for people who couldn't get into better programs. You're better than that." I went to the master's program anyway. I graduated with my MSW at 25, got my clinical license at 27, and built a career I loved, working at a nonprofit organization that provided services to homeless youth, ages 14 to 24. I helped teenagers find emergency housing when they had nowhere to sleep. I helped young adults navigate the impossible bureaucracy of trying to get government assistance when you don't have a permanent address. I connected kids with mental health services and addiction treatment, and educational programs and job training, and all the resources they needed to transition from living on the streets to building stable lives. I advocated for them in court when they got in trouble. I fought with landlords who didn't want to rent to teenagers with no rental history. I sat with them in emergency rooms and police stations and social service offices and every other place where homeless kids end up and get treated like problems instead of people. I loved the work even when it was heartbreaking, even when I lost kids to overdoses or violence or just the grinding reality of street life, even when the bureaucracy felt designed to prevent me from helping anyone. I loved it because when it worked, when a kid went from sleeping under a bridge to sleeping in their own apartment and showing up to school and building something that looked like a future, there was no better feeling in the world. My father hated it, not the work itself. He never bothered to understand the work well enough to have an opinion about it, but the fact that I was doing it instead of something he could brag about at firm parties. He hated that when his colleagues asked what his daughter did, he had to say social worker instead of lawyer or doctor or anything else that would have made them nod with approval, instead of making sympathetic noises about public service being important, even if it doesn't pay well. He made comments at family dinners about when I was going to pursue a real career, whether I'd thought about getting my law degree, since it's never too late, whether I'd considered that I could help more people if I made more money and donated it to charities rather than working for one. The comments hurt because they came from someone whose opinion I wanted to matter to me. Someone I wanted to make proud, even though I knew I never would, unless I fundamentally changed who I was and what I cared about.
I tried to explain my work to him over the years. I told him about Marcus, a 17-year-old I'd met in my second year at the nonprofit, who'd been living in his car after his parents kicked him out for being gay, who'd been sleeping in parking lots and showing up to school exhausted, who'd been about to drop out when I helped him find emergency housing through a program for LGBTQ youth and connected him with resources to finish high school and apply to college, who was now 22 and finishing his junior year at State University, studying engineering, with plans to get his master's degree. My father said that was nice, but it sounded like Marcus would have figured it out anyway, since he was clearly motivated enough to stay in school. I told him about Sierra, a 15-year-old who'd gotten pregnant and been kicked out by her family, who'd been living in a shelter when I met her, terrified and alone, and convinced she was going to lose her baby to foster care, who I'd helped navigate the system to get stable housing and prenatal care and support, who'd kept custody of her daughter and was now 23 with a stable job and her own apartment, and a 4-year-old she was raising in safety. My father said it was unfortunate she'd made such poor choices so young, but good that someone had helped her deal with the consequences. Nothing I said ever seemed to register as valuable work in his assessment. When my father announced he was retiring after 35 years at his firm, he planned an elaborate party to celebrate. He rented out a ballroom at one of the nicest hotels in the city, hired caterers, arranged for an open bar, invited 200 guests, including every partner and senior associate at his firm, family friends going back decades, our extended family, colleagues from law school, judges he'd worked with, basically everyone who'd been part of his professional and personal life over 3.5 decades of building his career. It was the kind of event that costs tens of thousands of dollars and gets planned 6 months in advance and requires a professional event coordinator because there are so many moving pieces. My mother spent weeks helping him with the guest list and the seating arrangements and the program, which was going to include speeches from multiple people about my father's career and his impact and his legacy. My father asked me to give one of the speeches, specifically about what it was like growing up as his daughter, what lessons I'd learned from him, what kind of example he'd set. I was surprised he asked me, given that he thought so little of how I'd applied any lessons he might have taught me. But I was also touched, because it felt like maybe he did value me, even if he didn't value my career. And I said yes. I spent weeks working on that speech. I wrote draft after draft, trying to find the right tone, trying to be honest about the challenges of growing up with a father who was rarely home because he was always working, but also trying to honor the positive things he'd taught me through his example. I talked about his work ethic and his integrity and his commitment to doing excellent work, even when it was hard. I talked about how he'd taught me to fight for what I believed in, to not give up when things got difficult, to stand up for people who needed an advocate, even when it wasn't convenient. I was trying to show him that I'd been listening all those years, that the values he'd instilled in me were the same values that drove my work, even if the work itself wasn't what he'd wanted for me. I practiced the speech until I had it memorized, until I could deliver it with the right mix of humor and warmth and genuine appreciation. I wanted it to be perfect because I wanted him to hear it and maybe understand that he'd raised a daughter who was doing work that mattered, even if it didn't matter in the ways he measured. The night of the party, I wore a dress I'd bought specifically for the event, something more formal than I usually wore, because I knew the crowd would be lawyers and judges and corporate types who dressed like they were always ready for court. I arrived early to help my mother with last-minute details and to make sure I knew when I'd be speaking so I could be prepared. The ballroom was beautiful, round tables with white tablecloths and elegant centerpieces, a stage with a podium and microphone, a screen for displaying photos from my father's career. Everything coordinated and expensive, and designed to celebrate someone whose work had been important enough to warrant this level of ceremony. Guests started arriving around 6, and by 6:30 the room was full of people in suits and cocktail dresses,
drinking wine and making conversation, and waiting for the formal program to begin. I sat at the table near the front with my mother and Daniel's girlfriend and a few family friends, and I watched the room fill with people who'd known my father professionally, people who'd worked with him on cases and respected his legal mind, and considered him a colleague worth celebrating. Several of my own colleagues from the nonprofit had come too, at my invitation, because I'd wanted them to meet my father and see this side of my life, even though I knew he'd never made an effort to see my side of his. My supervisor Karen was there, along with 2 coworkers I was close with, sitting at a table near the back, and I'd pointed them out to my father when they arrived, and he'd been polite, but clearly didn't understand why I'd invited people from work to his retirement party. I'd told him I wanted the people who mattered to me to be part of celebrating what mattered to him. He'd shrugged and said that was nice, and moved on to greeting more important guests. The formal program started at 7:30, with my mother giving a brief welcome and thanking everyone for coming to celebrate Richard's retirement after 35 remarkable years of legal work. Then, one of the senior partners from my father's firm gave a speech about working with Richard for 20 years, about the cases they'd won together, about my father's reputation as someone who never backed down from a complex legal challenge. The speech was full of inside jokes about specific cases and clients, and the lawyers in the room laughed at all the right moments, while everyone else smiled politely and clapped when it seemed appropriate. Another colleague spoke, then a judge who'd worked with my father on multiple cases, each speech building on the theme that Richard Mitchell was exceptional at what he did, that his career had been marked by excellence and integrity, and success measured by wins and settlements, and the respect of peers. Then my father stood up to give his own speech, and I listened with half my attention, while going over my own remarks in my head, making sure I remembered the order of the stories I wanted to tell, the specific phrasings that worked best. My father talked about his career highlights, about cases he was proud of, about colleagues he'd learned from, about the evolution of corporate law over 35 years, and how he'd adapted to changes in the field. He thanked the partners who'd supported him, and the associates who'd worked under him, and the staff who'd kept everything running smoothly. He thanked my mother for supporting his career and understanding the demands it placed on family time. And then he got to the part about his children. And I started paying closer attention, because I assumed he'd say something nice about both of us before introducing me to give my speech. "I'm proud of both my kids," my father said, smiling at Daniel and then at me, "though I have to admit that at least one of them followed in my footsteps into the law. Daniel here is carrying on the family tradition, building his own career in corporate law, making his old man proud by choosing a profession that actually matters." The room laughed, the kind of warm, approving laugh that comes when someone makes a self-deprecating joke that's really a compliment to themselves and their chosen field. I felt something tighten in my chest, but told myself he was just building up to talking about me, that he'd pivot to saying something kind about my work, even if it was different from his. "My daughter Lauren," he continued, "chose to waste her education on social work, playing therapist to people who won't help themselves. But I suppose someone has to do it, even if it doesn't pay enough to live on." The room laughed again, louder this time, 200 people finding it hilarious that my father's daughter had chosen such an obviously inferior career path. I looked around and saw people I respected professionally laughing at my life's work being dismissed as waste, saw my own colleagues near the back looking uncomfortable but not saying anything, saw Daniel looking down at his plate, clearly wishing Dad hadn't made that particular joke. I felt something inside me go very cold and very still. I stood there holding my prepared speech, the one I'd worked on for weeks, trying to show my father that I'd learned from him, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to give that speech. Not after he'd just told 200 people that my career was a waste of my education, that the work I loved was plain pretend at helping people who didn't deserve help anyway, that my entire professional life was a joke worth laughing at during his celebration of his actually important career. I reached into my bag and pulled out something else I'd brought,
A leather-bound portfolio I'd prepared weeks ago as a gift I'd planned to give my father privately after the party. Something I'd worked on for months, gathering materials I thought would help him finally understand what my work meant. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and walked to the podium with the portfolio instead of my speech. My mother looked confused. My father looked expectant, probably assuming I was about to give him some kind of award or certificate to commemorate his retirement. The room quieted down. 200 people waiting to hear what the daughter whose career was a waste had to say about her successful father. I set the portfolio on the podium and opened it to the first page, and I looked out at the room full of lawyers and judges and corporate professionals who just laughed at my life's work. And I started talking. I had a speech prepared, I said, keeping my voice calm and clear, about what an excellent father you've been, about the values you taught me, about how proud I am of your career. I'm not going to give that speech. Instead, I'm going to give you a gift. I held up the portfolio so people could see it. This portfolio contains 47 letters from young people I've worked with over the past 8 years in my career as a social worker. Letters from kids who were homeless and are now housed. Letters from teenagers who were in crisis and are now stable. Letters from young adults who had no one fighting for them until I did. Each of these letters is from someone whose life was changed by the work you just described as playing therapist to people who won't help themselves. I'd like to read you a few excerpts. I turned to the first letter in the portfolio, and I started reading aloud. This is from Marcus Reyes. I met Marcus when he was 17 years old. He'd been kicked out by his parents for being gay and was living in his car, sleeping in parking lots, showing up to school exhausted and barely hanging on. Here's what Marcus wrote. Lauren, I don't know where I'd be if you hadn't helped me find housing and stayed with me through the entire process of getting into the emergency program for LGBTQ youth. You visited me every week to make sure I was okay. You helped me fill out college applications when I was sure I wasn't good enough to get in anywhere. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I'm now 22 years old, finishing my junior year studying engineering at State University with a 3.7 GPA, and I have plans to get my master's degree. I have an apartment, a part-time job, and a life I never thought I'd have. You saved me. Thank you for not giving up on a kid who was sleeping in his car. The room had gone completely quiet. I looked up from the letter and saw people's faces changing, the amusement from my father's joke replaced by something that looked like discomfort, or realization, or maybe shame. I turned to the next letter. This is from Sierra Martinez. I met Sierra when she was 15 years old, pregnant, and homeless, after her family kicked her out. She was terrified she'd lose her baby to foster care. Here's what Sierra wrote. Lauren, you fought for me when no one else would. You helped me navigate the system to get stable housing and prenatal care. You came to doctor's appointments with me when I was scared and alone. You helped me figure out how to be a parent when I was still a child myself. My daughter Isabella is 4 years old now, healthy and happy. And we have our own apartment, and I have a stable job. And she's going to grow up knowing she's loved and safe. That's because of you. Thank you for believing a scared 15-year-old could be a good mother. I kept reading. Letter after letter, name after name, life after life that my wasted career had changed. James, who aged out of foster care at 18 with nowhere to go, and was now a restaurant manager with his own apartment. Rebecca, who'd been trafficked as a teenager and escaped with my help, and was now in college studying social work herself so she could help other kids the way I'd helped her. Tyler, who'd been addicted to heroin and homeless at 19, and was now 25, 3 years sober, working as a peer counselor at a recovery program. Jasmine, who'd been in 7 different foster homes by age 16, and was now 23 with a master's degree and a career as a teacher. On and on, 47 letters from 47 people
whose lives had been fundamentally changed by the work my father thought was waste. People were crying. I could see my colleagues near the back wiping their eyes. I could see some of the lawyers and judges looking uncomfortable, like they were realizing they'd laughed at something that wasn't actually funny. I could see my mother with her hand over her mouth, tears running down her face, because I'd never told her these stories in this level of detail. I'd never made her understand the scope of what I did, because it felt like bragging, and because I knew my father wouldn't care. My father's face had lost all expression. He was just sitting there frozen, staring at me. And I couldn't read what he was thinking, but I didn't particularly care anymore. I finished reading the last letter, closed the portfolio, and looked directly at my father. "These 47 people," I said, my voice steady, even though my hands were shaking, "disagree with your assessment that my career is a waste of my education. These 47 people would say that someone playing therapist to people who won't help themselves saved their lives when they had no one else. These 47 people matter, even if their lives don't generate billable hours or win cases that make the news, or build the kind of career you can celebrate with 200 people in a hotel ballroom. I hope someday you'll understand that the work I do matters as much as the work you did, just in ways that can't be measured by how much they pay or how impressive they sound at dinner parties. Thank you for coming to celebrate your retirement. I'm sorry I won't be staying for the rest of the evening." I picked up the portfolio, walked off the stage, grabbed my bag from my seat, and left the ballroom while 200 people sat in complete silence. My colleagues followed me out. Karen caught up with me in the hotel lobby and hugged me while I tried not to completely fall apart. And she told me I'd done the right thing, that someone needed to say what I'd said, that she was proud to work with me. My 2 coworkers agreed, and the 4 of us went to a bar down the street and sat there for 2 hours drinking wine and processing what had just happened, while the retirement party presumably continued without me. My phone started buzzing with calls and texts around 9:30. My mother, crying, saying she was sorry, that she'd had no idea the scope of what I did, that she was proud of me, that Dad was wrong to say what he said. Daniel, saying that was the most brutal thing he'd ever seen, and he meant that as a compliment, that Dad deserved it, that he'd always thought my work sounded hard and important, even if he didn't understand it. Friends and extended family who'd been at the party, saying I'd done the right thing, that my father's joke had been cruel, that the letters were powerful and moving, and made everyone in that room reconsider what they thought they knew about social work and helping professions. And my father, calling from a number I almost didn't answer, his voice strange and tight when I finally picked up after the 5th call. "I need to talk to you," he said. "I don't think there's anything to talk about," I said. "I was wrong." His voice cracked. "What I said was wrong. I didn't understand. I never understood. Those letters. Lauren, I had no idea. I never asked. I never wanted to know. I just assumed social work was... I thought you were wasting your potential on something that didn't matter. And I was completely wrong." I sat there in the bar listening to my father apologize for the first time in my entire life for anything related to my career choices. And I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to accept his apology, to tell him it was okay, to rebuild the relationship that had been damaged by years of him dismissing my work. But a bigger part of me was still angry, still hurt, still processing the humiliation of standing in front of 200 people while they laughed at my father's joke about my wasted life. "It's not enough," I said finally. "I'm glad you finally understand. But one apology doesn't undo 10 years of you making me feel like my work doesn't matter. Like I'm a disappointment because I didn't become a lawyer, or a doctor, or something you could brag about. I've spent a decade doing work I love, work that changes lives, work that matters to the people I help, even if it doesn't matter to you. And you never once asked me about it, in a way that suggested you actually cared. You made jokes about it at family dinners. You asked when I was going to get a real career. You made it clear that unless I fundamentally changed who I was and what I valued, you'd never be proud of me. And tonight, at your retirement party, you told 200 people that my career is a waste. So no, I don't think one phone call where you say you were wrong is enough to fix this. He was quiet for a long time. What do I need to do? He asked finally. I don't know, I said honestly. I need time to figure out if this is something that can be fixed at all. I need you to understand that the damage isn't from tonight. It's from every comment you've made over the past decade. Every time you implied my work doesn't matter. Every conversation where you suggested I should have chosen differently. Tonight was just the first time you said it in front of an audience large enough that I couldn't pretend it didn't hurt. We hung up without resolving anything. I went home that night and cried for hours, not because I regretted what I'd done, but because I was grieving the relationship with my father that I'd wanted and never had. The version of him who would have been proud of me for choosing work that helped people, even if it didn't pay well. Who would have seen my career as valuable because it aligned with values he claimed to hold, even if he only seemed to apply those values to work that came with prestige and money. The next few months were complicated. My father reached out multiple times, trying to make amends. He asked to visit my workplace and see what I did, which I eventually agreed to, and I showed him around the nonprofit and introduced him to some of the young people I worked with, and let him see firsthand what my days looked like. He met Marcus when Marcus came by the office to show me his latest engineering project. He met Sierra and her daughter Isabella when they stopped by to drop off thank you cards for the staff who'd helped them. He sat in on a group session I ran for teens in our housing program and watched me facilitate discussions about building life skills and setting goals and supporting each other through challenges. I could see him processing everything, trying to reconcile the work he was seeing with his previous dismissal of it, trying to understand how he'd been so wrong for so long. He wrote me a letter a few weeks after his visit, a long, detailed apology that acknowledged specific ways he'd dismissed my work over the years, that named his own bias toward prestigious careers as a failure of imagination and empathy, that said he was proud of me not despite my career choice, but because of it, because I'd chosen to do hard work that helped vulnerable people, because I'd built something meaningful, even when he made it clear he didn't value it. The letter felt genuine. It felt like he finally understood, not just intellectually, but emotionally, that the work I did mattered. I wrote back accepting his apology, but also making it clear that rebuilding trust would take time, that I needed to see through actions over months and years, that he actually respected my work, not just that he said he respected it after being publicly humiliated into recognizing its value. Our relationship slowly improved after that. Not back to what it was before. That version was built on me trying to earn his approval for work he'd never approve of. But something new, something more honest. He started asking questions about my cases in ways that showed genuine interest. He offered to help with legal issues that came up for the nonprofit, reviewing contracts and advising on compliance matters pro bono, because he said it was the least he could do to support work that mattered. He donated money to the organization, not a huge amount, but enough to show he was putting resources behind his newfound respect. He told people about my work now, at gatherings and dinners, and anywhere someone asked what his daughter did, and he talked about it with pride instead of embarrassment, describing the impact I had on young people's lives, mentioning specific kids I'd helped whose stories I'd shared with him. But the damage from that retirement party never fully healed. I forgave him for the comment itself, eventually, but I couldn't forget the feeling of standing in front of 200 people while they laughed at my life's work being dismissed as waste. I couldn't forget that it had taken public humiliation for him to reconsider his assessment of my career, that he'd needed to hear 47 letters from the kids I'd helped before he could see that helping them was valuable. I couldn't forget that left to his own devices, without the evidence I'd presented that night, he would have gone on dismissing my work for the rest of his life, would have made the same jokes at future family gatherings, would have continued treating my career as a disappointment he was too polite to mention most of the time, but too honest to pretend he respected. I'm 34 now, just over a year past that retirement party, and I still have the portfolio of letters. I've added to it over the past year. New letters from kids I've worked with recently, letters from young adults I helped years ago, checking in to tell me how they're doing. Letters that arrive unexpectedly, reminding me why this work matters, even when it's hard and underpaid and emotionally exhausting. I've thought about showing my father the new letters, but I decided I don't need to. The portfolio isn't for him anymore. It's for me, a reminder on hard days that the work makes a difference, that the kids I help remember what I did for them, that changing one life at a time in ways that won't make the news or generate billable hours or impress people at parties is still work that matters profoundly to the people whose lives get changed. My relationship with my father will probably never be what it could have been if he'd supported my career choice from the beginning, if he'd asked questions and shown interest, and treated my work with respect instead of dismissal. But it's better than it was. He knows what I do now. He understands why it matters. He tells people about it with something that looks like pride. And when people ask me if I regret confronting him so publicly at his retirement party, if I wish I'd handled it differently, I tell them the truth. I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret doing it. Sometimes the only way to make people understand the value of work they've dismissed is to present evidence so compelling they can't dismiss it anymore. 47 letters from 47 lives changed was evidence my father couldn't argue with. It silenced a room full of people who'd laughed at my career being called waste. And it finally showed my father that his daughter's education wasn't wasted. It was invested in work that mattered to the people who needed it most, even if it took him 35 years to see it.